And just so everyone knows, I've been doing it for about a week or so. I've been starting to record our classes that we have virtual as well on YouTube Live. So it's streaming, but no one really watches the stream. But if you can't get into Zoom and you're not here, you could get into YouTube and look at it. But it makes it so it's easier to it makes it easier for me to post them because it'll automatically be there. So I don't have to remember to go and upload the video and do all those kinds of things. So it can be immediately posted to our class and it's immediately available for anyone. So if you're not able to stay in for our virtual students, if you're not able to, I know that Zoom has been kicking off students off and on for some reason. You could always go to the YouTube channel and just view the rest of the class from there if you'd like. So just wanted to mention that so everybody knows. But let's go ahead and let's look at where we left off on Monday. Subtitles. Right. So from what we talked about Monday, we kind of talked about the conceptualization of sex and gender and about gender identity and gender expression, sexual orientation versus sexual behavior, just to kind of see I think the main purpose of that was to see the diversity of what we mean by male, female, or a man, woman, that things aren't always black and white when it comes to these things. But as we will see, when we look at the genderization of people, we try our hardest to fit people into these categories, to fit, as we'll see, a cultural narrative or some type of social norm that has been propagated by our socialization of what it means to be, human, man, woman, whatever it may be. So I kind of want to go over some of the views about what gender is, some of the approaches to understanding gender. Of course, we have a biological approach that focuses on hormonal and the biological mechanisms to understanding gender differences. And however, it ignores how the external world influences biological processes. So the biological approach really tries to understand why we have male, females. Obviously, one primary biological reason is for reproduction, because that's how human reproduction occurs. But also when we look at that biological approach, I want us to go back to and see that when we look at the hormone panel of individuals, there's not really a completely 100% male and a completely 100% female. We are all on kind of a bell curve, as you would say. And as we saw on the biological level, that there is overlap on those curves where there's individuals who have almost a even mix of hormonal panels, but also as far as physical biological characteristics, they can have both male and female genitalia and second body and secondary female male characteristics. Okay. The issue with the biological approach is that it ignores a lot of influences on biology. And as we'll see, there's a lot of psychological and social factors that influence, for example, when someone will go through puberty, when the puberty being defined as physical maturation from childhood to adulthood, when reproduction and the ability to conceive occurs. So taking a pure biological approach, we kind of get stuck in a fixed idea of what male and female really means for individuals, both physically, but also psychologically and socially. We also have a socio-cultural approach, which focuses on how culture and social settings determine sex difference. So as we will see again in this, as we go through this, we can see that culture and societies and social norms and life experience can influence our biology, but the socio-cultural approach ignores how hormones and biology respond to environmental events. And we'll see how biology kind of can color or change the way we perceive social and cultural ways of being. And then there's a contemporary approach, which is a study of how both biology and sociocultural mechanisms influence psychological understanding of maleness and femaleness. In the field of psychology, we call this the biopsychosocial approach to understanding pretty much anything we deal with when we're dealing with behavior and mental processes and who we are as individuals, because we're coming to an understanding that our biology, our social world, and our thought world, our cognitive world, our psychological world, all interact, and they all can have an influence on each other. That there's not really one dominant process that says this answers an entire question about who we are as human beings. Okay. I think I've mentioned in this class, but I always mention it in the developmental class and psychology classes, is that humans are unique in that we are born with underdeveloped brains. I think I have mentioned this, haven't I? Okay. Humans are one of the very few species that are born with an underdeveloped brain. The majority of our brain, almost 90% of our brain, develops between the age of 0 and 6. So instead of, like most species, who are born with a fully developed brain that was developed inside of the mother's womb, the majority of the human brain develops in the socio-cultural environment that it's being developed in. Only a few instincts and cognitive propensities are developed before we're actually born. And so when it comes to understanding even things like what you would think would be simple, like gender and sex and those kinds of things, and you would think that you could explain those just on a biological level, for human beings it becomes much, much more complex, because that's not where our brain is physically developing. Part of it, a majority of it, is developing in the social cultural world, not the developmental womb of the mother. Okay. So just some examples of the interplay between biology and the social world, and we can talk about female menstruation. Okay. When a female starts to menstruate, which happens during the puberty years, puberty is actually about a 2 to 3 year process. But once the menstruation is, once the puberty process is coming to an end, we can mark woman's kind of physical development from childhood to adulthood with her first menstruation. Okay. But you would think that menstruation physically developing would have something to do with biology and the biological clock. But as we can see, we can look at it on a cultural level, a larger cultural level, and we can look at post-industrial urban societies like the ones here in the United States. And we could look at agriculture, highland secluded societies like Papua New Guinea or Nepal, and we find that there's a gap On average, women in post-industrial urban societies have their first menstruation at the age of 12, whereas women in agricultural societies and more rural societies, the more rural the society becomes, the later the first menstruation comes on. For example, in New Guinea and Nepal, it's around 18 years of age is the first menstruation, okay? And, I should mention something that, is unique here in the United States that cannot be explained purely on a biological level, because we're not seeing this trend in a lot of other even modernized world, is the age of menstruation is getting younger and younger and younger, okay? If we were to take this class, 23, 24 years ago, the average age would have been 12. About 10, 13 years ago, it was around 11. Now we're reaching almost about 10 as the average age here in the United States. So over about the last 25 years, we see girls going through menstruation younger, younger, and younger. And indeed, the youngest girl in the United States to have her first menstruation was at the age of 4. So that's where we're seeing some menstruation starting. When I worked in the field of child sexual abuse, the youngest pregnant victim that I worked with, she got impregnated at the age of 8 and gave birth at the age of 9. So we see in our society that physical development is starting to get younger and younger and younger. And again, if we were in a developmental class, we'd be discussing, and we will discuss a little later, why it is psychological maturation is getting older and older and older. And for a sociology perspective, from a sociological perspective, we defined psychological maturation from a sociological perspective as the ability to self-sustain yourself, meaning that you can live on your own, pay your own rent, take care of yourself, and start a family, begin having a family, and all of those things, okay? Again, if we look at this, if we were to take this class, let's say 40 years ago, the age would have been 18. 20, 30 years ago, it would have been 21. Today, we're at the age of 27, okay? But in this context, we see a huge gender difference, all right? We see women going through psychological maturation on the average of the age of 21. That's when women, on average, are able to leave home, sustain themselves, take care of them, take care of a family, all of those things. For young men, the age is 34. That's when most men, or on average, most men are able to actually take care of themselves on their own. And then that average age between the two is 27. So when we talk about these things and we talk about how culture and the social world plays a role here in the United States, we have to ask, one, why is it that physical maturation is getting younger and younger and younger? Two, why is psychological maturation getting older and older and older? And the third question is, especially on the psychological maturation, why is there such a large gap between women and men? Okay, and those are all questions that we'll delve into as we move along in this class, but it's something that I'd like you all to kind of think about, so that when we get to that point and we get all through all these definition stuff, that we can have a conversation on what you all think is going on in our social and cultural world that is creating these dynamics. There are some what we call psychosocial stressors on menstruation. So we have found that an absent father, and an emotional distant mother-daughter relationship tends to make girls go through menstruation earlier. Depression and exposure to family conflict are all things that are variables that indicate that a woman, a girl, I should say girl, will go through menstruation at a younger age. We find if there's an active father, there's a close relationship between the mother and daughter, mental health is okay, and family conflict is at a normal level, girls tend to go through menstruation at a later age, okay? A lot has been said, I just mentioned about younger and younger age, about the sexualization of children and whether that has an actual influence on when a girl goes through menstruation. And the answer is no. And the reason is that when we look at sexualization of young girls, throughout history, young girls have been sexualized at very, very young ages, but that hadn't influenced when they went through menstruation. And we actually don't see an increase in sexualization. We're seeing a plateau of sexualization, yet we're still seeing a change in menstruation. Okay. The difference is when we have these conversations in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, is that from a cultural perspective, sexualization in children was held in the household. And so no one talked about it. No one communicated about it. The difference between then and our modern days of TikTok and our modern days of Instagram is that it's everywhere. But in reality, the sexualization of children has always been there, but it's been enclosed and encapsulated in the closeness of a family unit. So, but there's little evidence that there's been this increase in sexualization of children, which is associated with the increase of the age of a young girl going through menstruation. So from an evidence perspective, that there's just, the evidence is just not there. We can also talk about biological influences on gender. Okay, and one probably extreme example is congenital adrenal hyperplasia. This is when a female fetus is exposed to a high level of adrenal gland during prenatal development. Adrenal being the combination of the male hormones, including testosterone and I can't remember the name of it. It's an AD. And for some reason, maybe due to a lifestyle of the mother or hormonal imbalance of the mother or something, the fetus gets exposed to high levels of adrenal fluids. And what we find with this, what we find with young girls with CAH is they take on more of a boyish attitude. In fact, if you take on what would be considered the extreme tomboy type of young girl, tomboy meaning that it's not a choice that she's acting boyish. That's just who she is. We find that they have preferences for male toys, increased activities that we see among young boys, and a preference for things like rough and tumble play. So we can see in this sense how hormones can play a role in our experience of our gender. Okay. Now I should state that this is an extreme example, because when we look at, for example, people who are transgender but are not physically, what is it called? Transitioning. Okay, so let's say a boy who identifies as a female, but isn't biologically or medically transitioning to a girl. They don't have necessarily higher or lower levels of things like testosterone or things like that. So in this specific role, we have to understand that this is a unique thing. This can't be translated into, say, someone who is transgender or something like that. So we got to be careful with that. But we know that, biology influences this, because we know that when our hormonal levels go up and down, we go through certain changes, not necessarily genderized changes, but changes in, for example, sexual desire, motivational desires, and all of those types of things. So one approach to understanding sex differences comes from what's called the distal and proximal causes of sex differences. When we talk about this, what we're talking about is distal explains overall arcing reason for sex differences. Proximal are more immediate reasons for sex differences. And probably the thought experiment we could do to understand the difference between these two is to look at distal as if you were an alien, and kind of do this thought experiment in your mind. If you were an alien from another planet first visiting Earth, what would you observe as men and women go through their day-to-day activities? Okay, this is a distal exploration into differences between genders. Okay, and I could imagine, our world is changing a lot, and I get that, but we see, a lot men doing more physical jobs, construction, those types of things. Women would be doing, in my opinion, more technical, thought-based jobs. We would see a difference in who's in the service industries, who's taking care of children, who's maintaining the city systems. Now, we have to understand that things are changing in society. There's starting to be a lot of overlap in these, but there's still a pretty divergent amount or equal amount of things that are occurring based on gender. So that's the distal approach to understanding gender. So we would see things, for example, division of labor based on biological efficiencies. What are females more biological efficient at than are men, and vice versa? Okay. And so as we know that men tend to be more physically strong, yet women tend to be more pain tolerant. Okay, so while one has more physical strength, one can tolerate pain more. And so that makes those jobs different, the type of jobs they would go into different. Women tend to have a more nurturing biological makeup. The hormones that play into nurture tend to be more present in women, whereas more competitive hormones exist within men. So division of labor based on things like competition versus nurturing, working together, working against each other, tend to be things. So we can see, women, a really good example of this, because I worked in the field for many years, is the social services field, where you're trying to bring a community together, individuals together to solve a problem. It tends to be a female-dominated field, right? But then when you look at things like the military, that tends to be a competition, a battle, them against us. That tends to be a male-dominated field. Now, there's overlap, as we saw, remember our bell curves, but that's kind of what we would see based on the biological efficiencies of both genders. So on the proximal level, so now this is the individual level. So the first one was looking like an alien down on us and saying, okay, that person is this group versus this group, okay? The proximal level looks at the individual. So it looks at a lot of the stuff we talked about on Monday, about things like hormonal changes, okay? For example, there are hormonal changes as far as the strength as of men. Men start to lose testosterone starting at around the age of 40. And they also start to lose a lot of their quote unquote strength propensities, muscular propensities. Women start to have estrogen changes, especially when they go through menopause. And they start to having more weakened bones and start being less tolerant to things like pain. Gender identity, how we identify with our gender. Do we feel like a complete woman or a complete man, or do we feel that we're somewhere in between? And again, going back to the things that we talked about on Monday. And then we can't ignore the stereotypical expectations, right? I remember one of my very first Psych 101 classes. I was much younger. And I tried to teach a class without using the word man, woman, or any. I tried to take all gender out of the class. And at the end of the class, this was back in the day when we actually met in person. I don't know if any of you remember that, but and so I had this complete class full of students, and they all took their final exam. But it was weird because after their final exam, they stopped and they put the final exam and then they went sat back down, which I would never do. Okay, but they all sat back down, and after the last one was collected, this person raises their hand and says, at the time I had just my master's, and Mr. Peterson, we all have a question for you. I'm like, well, what? Are you gay? And I didn't actually directly answer them, but I thought about that class because that was one class where we had a challenge of not expressing gender norms in that class. It was the lessons and everything were designed to be gender neutral. And it's so interesting that that one class, because of the instructor, waited to ask to see if I was gay because I wasn't meeting stereotypical expectations. And so we got to realize that those play a role, and how they play a role, especially when we alter the way we have conversations purposely about them. And we have to also understand the way we genderize starts from a very early age. So, we have social roles as parents, and we then genderize those roles, and those become our stereotypical behaviors, or what we call schemas. A schema is our basic cognitive representation of a given object or thing, okay? So our expected schema, as this example is boys have trucks and girls have dolls. Boys like blue, girls like pink, those types of things, okay? The issue is, though, and when we take a closer look at this, is things like even genderized color are social constructs, okay? Indeed, when the first Sears Roebuck color catalog came out, I think it was in the 1930s, early 1940s, came out. Before that first Sears Roebuck catalog came out that was in color, pink was actually a boy color and blue was actually a girl color, because pink is actually harder to produce. So it's assumed that that's more of a masculine thing because you have to put more work into it. Blue is a fairly easy color to produce. Okay, so before about the 1930s, pink was a boy's color, blue was a girl's color. But when the Sears Roebuck catalog came out, for some reason, they decided to put the girls in pink and the boys in blue. And that's how today we assume blue should be the color for boys and pink should be colors of girls, it's because of a catalog from a store. Albeit it was the only source of catalogs back then, especially in color. So it was the only source of our knowledge. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make, and we can see even in primal times, boys had dolls, boys had all of those things. Girls did male type of things as well. They plowed the fields. They did, many women back in the day when families were being raised in the Western culture, I could speak specifically, and in the agricultural setting, it was the husband and wife that were out equally working a field with plow and animal. And it was the oldest child raising the youngest child. If there was a grandparent there, they would be involved. So the whole idea that mom was not a field worker, someone who got, quote unquote, her hands dirty, those kinds of things, those were all myths. That women are dainty and all those kinds of things, and they belong, in their, all those ways. And so I'm bringing this up in the specific area because we have to see how social roles and stereotype behavior and how culture and social norms play into our perception of what should be a girl and what should be a boy. So gender roles are how gender roles differ from the roles we have in life, such as parent, occupation, roles, leisure time, those kinds of things. And that's the question it tries to answer. So we look at leisure time, the gender role for women. If you look at a lot of movies who set a lot of our stereotypes, you often don't find in movies women out playing sports or driving the speedboat or playing football. And you don't find many men in leisure time roles out relaxing by the pool, as an example, or having drinks. Okay, we see more and more of that as time moves on, but stereotypically, that's not the view of leisure time. I think the big one and the one that we struggle the most with in our modern time is the roles of a parent. Because, young girls have always been taught that they will come up and they'll be responsible for the children they have. And young men are being raised up and being taught that they don't have any direct responsibility to their children. Their responsibility is to the family. And so what do we do in the single family household? Or what do we do when there's a mom who's already taking care of all of those roles of the male? Where does that leave that role for that male? And how fair is it to the single mom who is both taking care of her work and taking care of her kids? And so this is a struggle we're having right now because our traditional stereotypes, our traditional gender roles are teaching our children that these are their roles, but they're not the lived experience of many people in the United States. I think it's something like almost 60%, I believe. Don't quote me on this. I'll look it up between now and Monday, but now about 60% of our kids are being raised in single family homes. And a majority of young people between the age of 27 and 30, they become parents, but they don't become married partners. And so we're seeing a lot of changes in this, but we don't see those gender roles changing in response to it, which creates a lot of stress for single parents. It makes young men feeling like, well, where do I belong? It makes us have women who are definitely overworked and overstressed. And so this is something that I think is worth exploring more as we move along. And this is the important point, and the important point that I wanted to make about single parenthood and families is gender roles determine what one should do, but not what one ought to do. Okay, and I want to say that again. Gender roles determine what one should do based on culture, social norms, but it's not necessarily what we ought to do. It's not what we, in our given situation, in our given place, it's not necessarily the thing we should be doing, as we would say. And we do have to realize that I think this is an important thing, is what does a lot of gender roles reveal about how men and women should act? For men, we use the word agenic. For women, we use the word communal. Men should be masterful, assertive, competitive, and dominant. Women should be friendly, unselfish, concerned with others, and emotionally expressive. All right. Now, how do these play out even in our modern times where we have everyone playing, some people playing both roles? Like I just mentioned, mom sometimes has to be the masterful, assertive one, but also the friendly, unselfish one, because she's the only one running the household. Okay. Well, it's kind of interesting. This is another physical features. We tend to think that men should be muscular, strong, and tall, where women should be pretty, quote unquote, sexy and petite. And these are all, again, stereotypical gender roles that we hold on to with men and women. I should state something, though, really quick, and I think this is important. This is culturated views, okay? When we go look at other cultures around the world, this view doesn't always hold. For example, if we look at Pacific Islanders, they find petite women disgusting. They like the tall and large women, but they find petite very off-putting. Okay, and just in that same context, while muscular is important to Pacific Islander women, they like a little chunk as well, and guys that are really skinny and muscular are not so much a turn on. Now, this is some Pacific Islanders. There's some that still fit more Western stereotypes, but I just want to point out this view, because even here in the United States, this view has changed. If we look at men before the 1930s, 1940s, men who were really chubby and large were seen as more attractive than men who were skinny and more muscular, because it was assumed that they had access to more resources than those skinny, scrawny guys. And in the same vein, if we look at the evolution of what we find physically attractive and physical features of women, we can go back to, again, the times of Marilyn Monroe, who would not be considered a sexual icon today because of her body size, but she's a sexual icon because of the time she was at. So we can look at emotional expression, and as we can see, the expectations for women is that they're more emotional, where men are not. And so we see women sadness, embarrassed, fear, distress, sympathy, love, and happiness, where men maintain the gender role of more anger and pride. I think that this is one of those gender equalities that for men do men a huge disservice, because it's expected that really in our society, the only emotion that men should express are anger and pride. But when we truly measure emotions, both physiologically and psychologically, we find that women and men don't differ on any of these values, any of these emotional values on a psychological and physiological level. But the expression, the ability to express them, men tend to be seen as weak, as deficient, if they express things like love, sympathy, distress, even fear and embarrassment, which I think does a lot of, at least in my clinical experience, does a lot of damage to a lot of men. And on the same level, women who actually express anger, for example, tend to be looked down on very, very, badly. I can't think of a fancy. I'll give you an example. A female rapist. I worked with female rapists when I worked in a prison system as a clinician, and a female who is found guilty of a rape assault gets a sentence of about 5 to 10 times more than the average male who does the same type of sexual assault. I was working with women who assaulted one other individual, and they had a sentence of 18 to 20 years, where when I worked in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault, most men got a sentence of a year, maybe with 4 or 5 years of probation. So women, I'm using this as an example, when women act out in an aggressive or an angry or a dominating way, society really deems them as way less than even their male counterpart that does the same exact thing. So I just bring that up. And I do have to say these emotions have been measured on explicit and implicit levels, and they tend to hold true for people who even want gender equality. They tend to implicitly hold that men should only express these and women should have the ability to express these, but not those. So even when we're looking at our gender equality movements, if we measure these on an implicit level, on an implicit attitude level, we see that these emotion expressions still hold true. And I think this is when we take all of those gender roles into into account, I think it's interesting when we look at the potential diversity of gender. If we take a gender times culture times gender roles times gender expectation times age, there's about 200 subtypes of genders. When we combine the complexity of all of these things together, technically, according to this analysis done by Vaughn and Ashmore, there should be over 200 gender expressions. So it's kind of an interesting thing when we look at the actual complexity of gender and its role. Okay. So the other thing we have to ask is the first quality of a person we recognize, even though children are androgynous until about the age of 6 to 8. And this is something that I think we need to think about when we look at how culturally controlled gender really is. And I think it's an important thing to emphasize the role of culture and social norms. If we were to take a classroom of children under the age of 7, we'll average this out, under the age of 7, we cut their hair the same and we put them in the same clothing. Made sure they weren't wearing any makeup if they were allowed to by that point, and those types of things. No one would be able to tell the difference between who the girls in the room were and who the boys in the room were. Humans are actually androgynous until about the age of 8. it's only around the age of 8 that women's bones start to become more leaner. Men start to become more broader. Men start to become more muscular. Women start to, and we start on taking on those secondary sex qualities of males and females. But if we look at the way, I don't know if anyone's ever thought of this, well, that shouldn't have been possible before about the age of 8, unless we play a role in it. Okay. And so it's interesting, the quality, parents and how parents influence the way we develop into the gender that we're expected to develop into. Okay. I should also mention, I'll go back to this really quick. When we look at socialization of young children, okay, we see that young boys, if you actually measure behavior, and let's say you measure things like affection, so how much someone hugs each other, how much hold hands, the way they talk to each other, all of those things, if you measure those, young boys are just as affectionate as young girls. Young boys will have what would be considered in the teen years, female relationships up to the age of puberty. And then those are socialized out of those boys, because once they get to that age, both boys and girls start saying, oh, you're being a sissy. Oh, we shouldn't hold hands because that's not what guys do. I remember when I experienced this overtly, my parents and I used to work in a mall, old school mall. I know a lot of people don't know what those are anymore. We have one in Tucson still. But I worked in one with my parents, and one day I just ran up to my dad and I grabbed his hand and started walking down the thing like I always had. And he pulled his hand away and he said, son, you're to the age you need to be a man. You cannot be doing that anymore. You can't hold another man's hand. And I remember that clearly, but the reason why I bring that experience up is that's what we start doing to young boys at around the age of 8, 9, and 10, when we start seeing the more secondary sex qualities start to come out in boys and girls. So, and I imagine we might do the same with young girls as well. I think that's a predominant thing. We just know that we can measure this in young boys and how affectionate they can be in young childhood, especially with each other. All right. Where are we? So really quick, let's just talk about the different theories that we could utilize to kind of look at gender. So structural functional theory. So this would look at, how the structures in labor division of male and female has a functional purpose to keep society going. Conflict theory would say that power differences and the struggle between the genders creates constant change in these relationships. And I think we're seeing that right now, where we're seeing traditionalist views versus equality rights advocates. Right now, people between the age of I believe it's 38 to about 50, they're being called the sandwich generation, because they're stuck. There's a lot of dysfunction going on with this group. We see high divorce rates, high turnover rates at work, high uses of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. We're seeing a lot of dysfunction in this group. And a lot have argued it's because they're stuck between the traditional values of their older parents and the more equal rights, more men and women are the same movement of their younger generation, and they're kind of stuck in the middle. And I think this is where, again, I can give a personal example. Is when I went through my first divorce. I was in my late 30s at the time, and I received two different messages: the ones from my kids and the ones from my parents. My parents said, "All right, son, you date one person, you see if you're committed to them, and then you." So they said serial date, right? Get to know them, get to know, but don't do anything that is out of the standards of first date, the whole first base, second base, third base type of thing. My kids said, "Dad, go play the field, go have fun, do what you want, have this thing called a Netflix night, and all of these other things." And that was, for me, I'll admit, that was very confusing because when I first met my ex-wife, we met in a very traditional way. And so this age group right now is seeing a lot of dysfunction because of, and what conflict would theory say, what is traditionalist and what is equalitarian, equal rights advocacy, and how are those clashing together? And so what some would say, this is a good traditionalist thing, or some would have said bad equality rights thing. And we're seeing this adjustment in our society right now. What would a social identity theorist say? They would say that gender and identity of gender provides a place and a meaning in someone's life that brings a notion of predictability and understandability in their world. So why self-esteem based on gender is so important, okay? So social identity theory says that we take identities that are given to us from our social world. So if we look like men, that we're given the identity of male men, and vice versa for women. And that identification with a group provides meaning to one's life. It gives you something predictable where you should be in the world. Okay, and this leads to what's called self-esteem based on gender. And we know that, and the best example of how this plays out is when someone is gender identity confused. Now, I want to differentiate that from someone who is transgender. Transgender is someone who knows what their gender should be, even though their physical body isn't. Gender confused is someone who doesn't know if they should be masculine or feminine, whether they're somewhere androgynous, somewhere in between. They're very confused about what their identity is. And we find that these individuals are at high risk for things like suicide and suicide attempts, mental health issues, mental health risk. There was a famous study done by the BAMs, it's Dr. Bam and Dr. Bam. They wanted to see what would happen if they raised their children with no gender involved. So there was no blue or pink clothes. There was no girl-boy toys. They were all intermixed. And they even went to the trouble of, when they went through their children books, they would cross out anything that said boy, girl, he, she, all of those different pronouns out of children's books to make it so that they were raised basically genderless. So they wanted to know what would happen if their children wasn't socially genderized, okay? And even into early childhood, the children received a lot of bullying. The boys were confused at why the girls didn't want to play with them. The girls were confused at why the boys didn't want to play with them. And they struggled with their mental health through a good part of their life, okay? Now, there's a flip side to the BEM studies, because they say, their children always maintain their emotional, those types of things. But the other side of it is they always struggled with their mental health and their self-esteem because they didn't know where they belonged in when they went outside of their family house. So that's an example of identity and how it plays a role. in our, at least our emotional well-being. And then the symbolic interactionists would say that symbols of gender is an important aspect of being human and provides symbolic meaning, okay? And we can see this throughout history. We can see many of our early symbols going prehistorically had to deal with the female body and the pregnant female and the birth and those types of things. And those had very important symbols for prehistoric individuals. And we can see symbols of the men, therefore, capturing the animals so that they can bring it back to the mother, all those kinds of interactive types of things that a lot of anthropologists believe was the basis of a lot of our modern societies, is when those symbols started to come into existence about the men being in the, you see the guy throwing a thing at a buffalo, and you see the figurine of a female with the pregnant belly and those types of things. So symbols is where we start to see the development of modern societies coming out of prehistorical times into more modern agricultural times. So that's an example coming from anthropology about symbolic interactionism, okay? All right, I'm going to stop there.